So we want to spend our time or?
Ready? Ready.
Oh,
Always ready.
I see. This is a good
Fine.
ride.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
You want to sit down?
Well, I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think they're just going to start. She said she's going to start. I don't think she's waiting for all that. So we should start now? Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, she said wait. Okay.
I wonder, do we have to keep our masks on?
No. I didn't have mine on. So let's figure out what we're going to do. Let's talk about why we wrote the book. And then maybe let me talk about what it was like to write the book, the differences, and then
And how long are we talking for?
probably about.
Andrew,
I would say.
Do you know Walter Turner?
Of course. No, I don't know Walter Turner.
we just saw him on the way in.
Everything's good. So I'm going to introduce you.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to introduce you.
Okay.
Okay. How you doing? Good. I love that visualization series.
Thank you.
So, is there anything that you're going to basically welcome people to market, talk about another event? I'm going to introduce that.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Great.
Nice. I was thinking about that, saying something about them. They're not here, so that's great. See, political people know. I was just saying some people don't talk about Beth and Eric. It's like political people know. So we count on you to
we do events.
Yeah, I know. We always do.
Right.
And then we do events. With
Sometimes
all
we do them
four.
together.
Right.
But I mean, I was like, I should have guessed that Walter would know the right thing to do.
I'm trying to do the right thing, okay?
Oh, I want to get some.
Yeah, I just brought this. You want to get
I
your?
spoke to Cassandra about something in April, you in conversation perhaps with Robin Spencer
Oh, Robin Spencer.
somebody like that. So I'll let you know. I always
Okay.
spoke with Cassandra.
Where? Or
Everett.
Maria.
Okay.
I want to get some water.
Yes, water, Glenn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the visualization series.
Oh,
I loved it.
thank you. We're still working, which is so exciting. You know, we have like 4 museums now and a new space, and
Right, well,
the students are so excited.
The cultural lens and having people like Jose James,
Yeah.
Terry Lynn Carrington,
Yeah.
all that was really nice.
Yeah.
It was really nice.
Yeah, they want to make an album out of that, and
We should do that.
Yeah. So
Okay. And I'll put my, so we can see how many movements we have.
okay. But I just don't know what so they're signing after. So basically, it can't go more than an hour, right? Because we got to do the
We
signing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. Sure. Okay.
Folks, we get ready to get started.
So what I'm doing is this.
Wait till the end, please.
Sorry, she wants to start right now.
Settings.
So, welcome. Good afternoon. We're all honored to be here. My name is Walter Turner, and it's great to be able to welcome you to Marcus Books. This is the oldest Black-owned independent bookstore in the nation, and hold your applause because we have another round of applause coming right after that. And you know, as I was driving here, it says Marcus Books, but all of us who have been with the Richardsons since the 1960s know that it's so much more than a bookstore. Everybody who's anybody who's walked through here, you come in here for counseling. You come in here to look a book about your children. When it's the anti-apartheid struggle, when it's issues around Palestine, they're always on the forefront of those issues. They make themselves available. So we need to give another round of applause for the Richardson family and for Blanche who is here with us today. We have one event which is coming up, which is going to be coming up on Sunday, December 4th from 1 to 3. It's a book called Trauma, Tresses, and Truth with Lizette Wazer. And this is a very interesting book about hair. It comes out of a workshop which was held last year. So you want to get out and check that. The other thing, one of the best ways to support Marcus Books is to be here, is to come in to make sure that they're here, that you're purchasing their books, that you go through your school. If you're teachers, you work with children's program, to come here. Blanche told me the other day, I wanted to repeat it, that every Friday has been Black Friday at Marcus Books for about 60 years. So you need to come through. I do want to let you know that today we're very blessed to have Dr. Angela Davis and Dr. Gina Dent, who are going to be here in dialogue on their book, Abolition, Feminism Now, which is on Haymarket Press. And there are copies available, and you'll be able to get copies signed after we finish with the presentation. I want to, there are 4 authors of the particular book who you should know. First of all, I want to say just a few words about Beth Ritchie. I want to say a few words about Erica Miners, who are authors of the book. And then I'll get to an introduction of Dr. Davis and Dr. Dent. Dr. Beth Ritchie is the head of the Department of Criminology, Law and Justice, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. The emphasis of her scholarly and activist work has been on the ways that race, ethnicity, and social position affect women's experience of violence and incarceration, focusing on the experiences of African American battered women and sexual assault survivors. She is one of the co-authors of the book we're talking about today, Abolition, Feminism Now. Dr. Erica Miners is a professor of education and women's gender and sexuality studies at Northeastern Illinois University. She is a writer, organizer, and an educator. She is the author of For the Children, Protecting Innocence in the Carceral State, and the co-author of The Feminist and Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence. She is one of the co-authors of the book we'll be talking about today, Abolition, Feminism Now. I want to say a word here about Dr. Gina Dent, who's currently an associate professor of feminist studies. Before I finish with the introduction, if you have an opportunity, she has been part of a series, I believe, sponsored by UC Santa Cruz, where she's at, which is entitled the visualization of visualizing abolition. It's a beautiful piece because what it does is it looks at this topic of abolition and feminism from so many different angles. And if you go online, you take a look at it, you're going to see musicians like Terry Lynn Carrington. Who else was I mentioned there? You're going to see Robin Kelly. You're going to see Albert, the late Albert Woodfox. You're going to see Mumia Abu-Jamal. You're going to see Nicholas Payton. And I would suggest that if you really want to look at these intersections of culture and art, feminism and abolition, that at some point you check that out. It's called Visualizing Abolition, and you can just Google it and you'll be able to see that. Dr. Dent is currently an associate professor of feminist studies, history of consciousness, and legal studies in the humanities division at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research interests include Africana studies, legal theory, and popular culture. She has 2 forthcoming books, Prison as a Border and Other Essays, and Anchored to the Real, Black Literature in the Wake of Anthropology. These are going to be published on Duke University Press. She is one of the co-authors, along with Dr. Davis, Dr. Miners, and Dr. Ritchie on Abolition, Feminism Now, which argues for a prison abolitionist view of feminism. And again, check out that series on visualizing abolition. It's well worth your while. When I clicked on it, I just found myself watching it, listening to the music pieces. So it's good, okay? Dr. Angela Davis, teaching career has taken her to many institutions, San Francisco State, Mills, UC Berkeley, Claremont. She is now a distinguished professor emeriti of history of consciousness and interdisciplinary PhD program at UC Santa Cruz, as well as of feminist studies. She has authored more than 11 books, although when you do Google, you're going to see those 11, but you're going to see all this other stuff. So I don't know what the number is, but she's well written and she's well spoken. She is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to educational institutions. This conversation that you're going to be part of today on abolition feminism now, and when you get the book, you'll be able to read through it. It began as early as 2001 with Insight and with Critical Resistance. And this is something that began before the pandemic. So it's really been a labor of love, and it's gone on for, at this point, it looks like close to a couple of decades. So what you're seeing is the fruit of that. Dr. Davis's books that focus around this particular topic include Are Prisons Obsolete?, Abolition, Democracy Beyond Empire, Prisons, and Torture, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of the Movement, as well as the book which we're talking about today, Abolition, Feminism Now. It is a greatest of honors here, as they say, in the town, in Oakland, to have Dr. Angela Davis and Dr. Gina Dent talk with us and share with us their work. So please welcome them the way they should be welcomed.
Sorry, we're doing the you start
She said
thing.
you start. I said you start.
I think I lost.
Okay, good.
Well, it might help because we know that you know who this is. I mean, we're just here to talk to you about this book. And I should say, though, my bio didn't have certain elements because it's my official, I don't know, university bio or something. But I, too, was one of the originators of Critical Resistance and started with that early movement. So for me, this work also extends back about 25 years or more. So I guess we just want to talk a little bit about why we wrote the book. And I think we can answer questions too, right? Yeah. And first of all, I want to thank you for being here. And I'm so pleased to be in this space. It's the first time I've spoken here. But I have to say that I have relied on Marcus Books for most of my life. I used to live in San Francisco, about a block from the San Francisco store. And I would drop by on my way back from university. And I was always treated with the utmost kindness. I spent many, many hours perusing the shelves. I was gifted many things. And I would have to say that Marcus Books was as important in my education as any other thing that I had in my life in any university I attended. So thank you to Marcus Books. And I'm so glad we're still here. So this book has come out with a flurry of other abolitionist books. I'm actually facing a shelf. And so beautifully, I'm looking at one of Beth Ritchie's books, Arrested Justice there. I'm looking at Derricka Purnell, Becoming Abolitionists. And of course, we didn't know that when we started writing this book. We came together because Beth and Erica apparently had a few cocktails and decided that we should be drafted to write this book with them. And we all thought it would be fun and very quick because we'd spent decades being in hallways and in the sides of rooms after meetings or during meetings, complaining in abolitionist environments about the lack of attention to feminist questions, and in feminist environments about the lack of attention to abolitionist questions. And so we just figured the four of us could very quickly come up with what it would take to say something to the movement about the fact that we consider these movements to be inseparable. In fact, we consider it to be one movement, and we consider an abolitionism which is not infused with feminism, and of course anti-racism and all the other things, but those tend not to get left out, to be not a full abolitionism, and also that any feminism worth the name cannot be attached to carcerality, cannot be a carceral feminism, cannot be about expanding the footprint of the prison, which has come to mean that we have to, as feminists, really ask deep questions about how we have been part of bolstering the prison system and why so many of our demands are so tethered to the current criminal legal system, assuming that the value that we have in society is measured by the degree to which the harms against us are taxed by long prison sentences. In other words, what does it mean to say that a harm is not socially recognized until it engenders a very long prison sentence? And of course, what does it mean to have also increased the levels of surveillance, the implications with the criminal legal system, because so many people who have been harmed have had to enter into that system trusting that they would be taken care of, and finding instead that that their lives were deeply damaged by the confrontations in the pursuit of justice. And so as we sat down to write this, we wanted, as Walter pointed out, to say something to the feminist movement, but very importantly, we consider this to be an abolitionist book, not merely a feminist book. And I think this is actually something that I want to stress. Many people say to us, "Oh, you're adding feminism to the abolitionist movement. That's really great. This is a feminist text." In fact, even our publisher, Haymarket, we love Haymarket, but they did classify us very recently on an announcement. There was a whole section of text on abolition, and then they had text on feminism, and they put us in the feminist category. We haven't even told our editor yet, but we wanted to really object to that classification because it tends to minimize the importance of really thinking feminist questions as central to abolition. And so if we are going to transform society, if we are going to treat real harms, which means treating interpersonal and state harms, including incarceration, then it means simultaneously focusing on how to get people away from unsafe situations, but also it means redefining safety and security in ways that the state has not. It means building up a social network that allows us to have healthcare, to have attention to disability, to have economic justice, that allows us to have housing and all the other needs satisfied, so that we actually don't find ourselves in the situation where we have so much violence. Because we know that one of the main causes of violence, besides the fact that so many young people, especially young people of color, are deprived of access to real education and real human life-sustaining activity, but also that we are deprived of the ability to think outside of this system of incarceration. And so this book is an attempt to think through those questions, which seemed utterly simple to us until four people tried to sit down and write together. You want to suck over from there?
Okay. Well, thanks, Gina, for opening it up. And I also want to say how happy I am to be in this space at Marcus Books. Actually, I think I've been here how many?
1,000.
2,000 times. But Blanche, I told you I just spoke at Grace Cathedral over in San Francisco I delivered the morning sermon
This morning.
this morning. And I was talking about my father, who was an Episcopalian lay reader, which reminds me that my father and Blanche's father were very good friends. They went to school together. And I also taught at San Francisco State with Blanche's mother. She was my colleague there. So I feel really connected to this institution and want to do everything I can to make sure it continues to exist. So that is something I want to pass on to you as well. Now, I think Gina ended with the remark that we thought this was going to be an easy book to write because all four of us are practically lifelong activists in these struggles. We know what abolition is. We thought we knew. We've also been involved in feminist movements to the extent that we have been engaged in critique of feminism that is not anti-racist, that is not anti-capitalist. And so because we had these ideas in our head, we figured that all we'd have to do is, spend a couple of weekends together and we could write the book. As it turned out, the pandemic happened. So we never actually got to get together in person. We did it all on Zoom. But as soon as we began to brainstorm around the book, we realized how absolutely different we all were. We realized that our training made a big difference. Erica is an amazing education scholar. And Beth is a sociologist. Gina is a literary scholar, a literature scholar, and my field is philosophy. So we realized from the very beginning that we were like butting heads. So we had very different ideas about terms, and so
Friendly butting heads.
yeah, friendly. But to tell the truth, there was a point when I said, this book is never going to be finished. Because we have to work through so many of the basic ideas. And it was actually really a wonderful experience having all of those conversations and engaging in those critiques and recognizing that although our movement work has been the same, although our basic ideas are similar, we're all anti-capitalists, we're all anti-racist, we're all abolitionists in a broader sense, and not only the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of police, the abolition of borders, and so forth. So it was a remarkable experience trying to work. At first, we saw ourselves as working through our differences or working across our differences. But then we began to recognize in writing the book that it was the differences that was so interesting, that could bring us together in a way that was far more profound than simply agreeing with this idea or that idea. So this is the hardest book I've ever written. And the other day we were giving a presentation at the National Women's Studies Association, which met this year in Minneapolis. And we were suggesting academics here that in what kind of credit you get for writing, that if you write a book with 4 people and you wanted to count toward your tenure or count toward a promotion, they're going to give you 1/4 of the credit for it. But we made the point that this was much harder to write than it would have been had only one of us written the book. So we suggested that people engage in campaigns on their campuses. These were mostly graduate students and faculty to guarantee that collaborative work, collective work be valued in the way that it should, so that academic work ceases to be this solitary, individualistic process. And I think I'll end there, Gina.
Trying to think where to go next. Well, I want to say a couple things about what we were encouraged to do from the editors, which led to some of these impasses. I mean, what they really wanted was a manifesto. You know, when people think about books that are going to be for the public, that they think the public can read, which is a very, I think, a low estimation of what people who are not academics can actually absorb. The idea is that everything should be laid out as, kind of like 10-point plan, what people should do. So they basically they were telling us to write a manifesto. And we didn't want to. We really wanted to have a book that had some historical richness, because revisiting how the story of incarceration has been told as a US only story, as a story only about mass incarceration and the racial violence extending from slavery, as a story that was about the war on drugs, as a story that sometimes is about just addressing a certain narrow set of harms, was really not our story, and that to add these other elements was going to be very, very complicated. So to add something about borders, to add something about indigenous people, conquest, colonization, boarding schools, to add something about Japanese so-called internment, which is another form of incarceration, to add something about the carcerality of schools, to add something about our own cultural investments in incarceration that all of us are forced to identify into, whether we want to or not. That was far more complicated, because we're talking about ideology, we're talking about the way people think, we're talking about the way people think even when we assume we're against prisons. Because all of us are living in the now. We're living in a moment when something happens in our lives, something happens to someone else, and we have to react. And so one of the things we really were working on is the temporality of abolitionist work. In other words, in the present with the harms that we see now and address them, but also not address them in a way that is going to bolster the prison industrial complex and lead. How do you address what's there? You're not ignoring it, which is why sexual violations were so central to our jumping off point. But we, at the same time, wanted people to understand that there's so much evidence now that furthering incarceration toward reducing that violence was a failed project. That surrounding police departments and communities and surrounding prisons was, an increase in domestic violence in the area, not a reduction. That the fact that people were moving through prisons and being introduced to more violent systems, not because, by the way, of being introduced to other people who are incarcerated, but because the prison system itself is violent, was creating further violence in our communities. And so trying to explain that felt to us not like a manifesto or a 10-point plan. It really felt like we had to really somehow, in very few pages and few words, explain how we got to this place, explain alternative ways of thinking, and try to redirect movement toward struggling for something complex, but we also think is ultimately achievable, but not in our lifetimes, most likely. If we're lucky, we'll live to see some transformation, as we already have. I think Angela and I never really expected in 1997, with the beginnings of critical resistance, for example, that I would be able to casually say things like prison industrial complex and people are nodding their heads, or that we'd be able even to talk about decarceration or compare to other parts of the world. So these are things that have dramatically changed, and I think that's I know that's a result of the agitation that many people have been engaged with. Probably many of you in this room. I can't see with your mask, but I probably recognize some of you. But Angela was talking about how difficult it was, and of course it was. Although she makes it sound really bad, I don't know if it was that bad all the time. But we did meet every week on Zoom.
It was bad. It was hard.
She means
It was hard. It was challenging. It wasn't bad.
Yeah. But I think the point is that.
But it was bad.
It was. Some of us like challenges more than. Anyway, I think that the point was that really getting down to trying to figure out how we understood a term. So, what did each of us think abolition really meant? What did each of us think harm really meant? What did each of us think violence really meant? So, simple words were taking us a really long time to contend with.
But what genealogy?
I wasn't going to get into that because that's more philosophical, but we did have a big debate we had different uses of the term genealogy, which can mean either like family genealogies, that way, familial resemblances, sure, lineage, but can also mean the genealogical approach, which is, for those of you who read Michel Foucault and understand philosophy, it's a way of thinking about the history of the present, rethinking the way in which we come to ideas. And I'm not going to keep explaining that. I'm happy to some other venue, but the point was that we were each operationalizing a different definition of a word. And so when we were then trying to come to one voice as we were writing, we had to work through those definitions. And so what we hope now finally looks like a smooth text was not a smooth text for a very, very long time. But I will say, for me, the joy of that and our capacity to do that comes from the movements. That we'd been in movements for a very long time in which we were working out these questions and discussing them. So we didn't come to this without any habits that allowed us to do collective work. And I think that was also really striking, that as bad as she's making it sound, we weren't fighting. We weren't full of conflict with each other. What it was we realized more and more that we needed to be able to explain things to others because we needed to be able to explain them to each other. And so that was really exciting work. And it was really exciting to realize that in the decades of having done this work, we had learned things. I guess I don't push throw it back.
I wanted to say that that we really didn't want to dumb down the book because there's so frequently the assumption that if you don't have the necessary preparation, if you haven't gone to college or graduate school or whatever, then you're not going to understand a certain kind of language. And, I was just thinking that the last time I was here in this bookstore, it was with Erica Huggins and her new book, which is called Comrade Sister, Women in the Black Panther Party. And I related a story about my involvement in the Black Panther Party during that session. And it had to do with my experiences as the head of the Liberation School, the political education process. And I remember this young man, teenager, 15, 16, who had never really learned how to read. He'd never really learned how to read. And so I assigned State and Revolution by Lenin. And, rather than turn away, he struggled with that text. He used a dictionary. He was determined to figure out, what was at stake in that text. It was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had as a teacher. Witnessing that when someone felt that reading really mattered, that he would devote all of his strengths and resources to it. So that has helped me to kind of challenge the notion that there is this hard division between, people who have advanced education and people who don't. I would go so far as to say that some of the most interesting intellectual work right now is happening behind walls in prison. And you're talking about people who never had any formal training, who taught themselves how to read and write as a means of survival, surviving long terms behind bars. So that was in part from where I stood, an argument for not dumbing the book down, not as, but not for not explaining. Sometimes using complex concepts, but making them accessible. And I think that again was a very interesting aspect of writing the book. Conversations about what particular terms would say to particular people, and feminism. That is a term that's still contested. All of these decades later, it is still a contested term, and all of us have been involved in feminist movements, but not feminist in the old sense. Because when I wrote the first book that focused on women, and which was called Women, Race, and Class, I always hesitate because I was teaching a course at San Francisco State at the same time, which was called Women, Class, and Race. So I can never remember. And I have a kind of dyslexia, so I switch things around. But anyway, I remember that after I wrote that book, I began to be referred to as a feminist. And my response was, feminist? I'm not a feminist. I'm a revolutionary Black woman. That was my response then. 1981 was when that book was published. But 1981 marked a particularly important moment in the publishing of writings by Black women and by women of color. This Bridge Called My Back was published in 1981. I think Bell Hooks' Ain't I a Woman was published in 1981. So many books were published during that time. And I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is that the very nature of feminism has been transformed. And if we look at the fact that the term intersectionality is probably the most popular term related to feminism, and it's about the relationality of not only race and class and gender, but a whole range of concepts. We were looking at feminism, and particularly feminism as it was expressed in the movement against domestic violence and gender violence, as we say it today. When was that conference at UC Santa Cruz, The Color of Violence?
In 2003.
2003. There was a conference at UC Santa Cruz precisely on the ways in which the organizing and the conceptualization related to the domestic violence movement, which was increasingly becoming institutionalized, which was increasingly becoming intertwined with the government, so much so that there were critiques of the domestic violence activists coming from those of us who were involved in the abolitionist movement, arguing that if they continued to simply use punishment as the way to address the problem of gender violence, that they would be, perhaps inadvertently, but nonetheless, they would be continuing to expand the carceral system. So there was a very interesting debate that took place at that conference. And Beth Ritchie, as Gina pointed out, is someone who has been involved since she was a teenager in domestic violence, which she knows the movement and has been really pivotal in helping to turn that movement around and moving it in a direction that will not be responsible for the production and reproduction of more violence and more racism. And just one point about Erica and her work, as you pointed out, that she was doing work on sex offender registries, and she has a book. I can't remember the title of it now.
Walter just gave two, so For the Children, and then the other one is, sorry, Erica. Just one second.
Well, anyway,
it's escaped me right now.
It's an amazing book because we're ideologically primed to not even want to have to deal with the question of sexual violence directed at children. And even those of us who argue that you can't say that abolition works up until a certain point and then it doesn't. It's hard. It's really hard. It's hard thinking about the damage that has been done to so many children as a result of sexual violence. But Erica tackles the issue in a way that is so interesting and so enlightening. I remember when I read it, and she pointed out that we should stop and think about the fact that these sex offender registries exclude certain perpetrators. And who do you think they exclude? Well, they usually exclude priests,
clergy,
right?
Mm-hmm.
But they also exclude people who've been convicted of incest. And so it's the assumption that the stranger danger is the real challenge, and it prevents us from addressing the ways in which the nuclear family itself has harbored, all of these ideas and notions and practices that lead to the production of sex. So it's a great. I would suggest you all read it. Maybe we'll figure out the title.
Feminist and Sex Offender is one book, and For the Children's another. I use my Google brain.
Yeah.
Which is, what Angela's pointing out is another reason we wanted to write the book is the question that we get when we speak everywhere in the world, which is what to do with the bad people.
Yeah.
And the examples that always come up are these examples, right? So we need to confront those examples that had to be a part of the way we entered into talking about abolition. And we're not finished. I'm getting maybe your hopes up for this book solving all the problems in the world. It does not. And we were, I think one of the reasons it was hard to finish it is we always felt like there was so much we needed to include that we couldn't. I want to talk about one thing that was really important to us. I talked briefly before about changing some of the narratives that have stabilized work, especially the work that's characterized as against mass incarceration, because that work sometimes, kind of often, does veer toward the idea of the perfectibility of the system. So the idea is if you got away from race being a driving factor or class being a driving factor, that somehow we'd end up with the real bad people in prison. And so, that has been something that abolitionists have been contending with for a long time, but also the US-centered focus on the prison, and not just the US centrism of the movement, but the way in which we wanted an international perspective, if not global coverage, to be at the center of the book. Being in occupied Palestine, which is often referred to as an open prison, is another form of experiencing carcerality. But when we travel for our work, we usually try to get admitted into a prison wherever we are. And of course, being denied access is part of the story as well. So places we've been denied access, like Singapore, Japan, France, I could go on, that's a long list. But then places where we have been inside, Argentina, South Africa, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, as of a few days ago. And those experiences and work with organizations in those places has been key to our evolving understanding of both the problem and of some of the solutions. And so we wanted to give that perspective to the book, some way of what was referred to academically as deprovincializing the US. So basically allowing us to not be understood as defining meaning for everything, for every concept, for every historical moment, everywhere. So it was always going to be a dissatisfying feeling to try to do this, because we could really, in the number of pages we had, not include many international examples. Just as we didn't talk about Japanese incarceration, we just make a casual reference. But we felt like just inserting sometimes some of these references was a way to get people to think, oh, actually, I should include all of this in what I'm thinking about as abolitionist. And so we confined our analysis to struggles that we knew well, organizations we'd been a part of over the years, so that we had some sense of how they'd evolved and changed. But I do want to say that I hope that people will read this text with a sense of that framing that comes from a view that is not only about this historical moment, so that it looks past and it looks forward, but also that it is a view that comes from working with people internationally and transnationally on these issues, and being inspired by the work of many. Some examples that are really meaningful to us include some things that do feel like reforms when we face the United States. We work with an organization called Sisters Inside in Australia. We've been working with them since, I think, 2001.
Yeah.
And that organization, which is a service organization and a legal organization, does that work in an abolitionist frame now. It didn't start out that way. It evolved into it. But they also have a board, which includes people inside. So they have their board meetings inside the prison. Now, this is not something we've ever been able to experience inside the United States. We don't know any organization that has been able to function in that way, but we always lift it up as an example because it's something to aspire to, not because we want prisons to exist for all time, but in the time we live in now, that would be a really significant change from what we've had. Since I mentioned Portugal, I'll just say that we went into, we were in Lisbon and Sintra this past week, a few days ago. We got back on Friday, and we were there for a film festival, which was important to me because, as Walter introduced, I've been deeply interested in the realm of culture, especially popular culture, film, television, not just because, it's fun to watch movies, because actually once you start to study the prison, they lose their fun, actually, but because I have a deep belief that the domain of culture reinforces the world of incarceration in ways that we fail to interrogate. And it's been rather unpopular for many years amongst my activist colleagues to focus on this area because it's always considered kind of light. Or if we wanted to teach, show a film or something, what we do is we show a documentary to show how horrible conditions are. But my argument has been for many years that people pretty much know who are coming to these films how bad prisons are already because they came to our event. But what we probably don't know as well is how much we're affected by the cartoons our kids watch, by the fact that every hour of every day you can see something that represents the presence of jail, prison, and the police. And so the way in which we fail to understand those materials and the effect they have on us also affects our movement and our capacity to imagine alternative solutions. And so the domain of culture is deeply important to me. And I was thrilled to be able to think about going to a film festival which had a theme called in Portuguese, but Romper as Claves, but breaking the bars, which focused on films about incarceration, but then added us and some others to programming surrounding the festival so that people could talk about these problems further. And as part of that festival, we went to a prison in Sintra called Linho. And that's a men's prison there. When we watched Charles Burnett's film, To Sleep with Anger, with some of the men inside, and then had a discussion afterwards. The first thing I'll say is it was a shock because we were all gathering to watch the film. And I didn't realize that any of the men who were incarcerated there were in the room with us because they were all wearing regular clothes. Yeah. And were interacting with us without a guard stepping between us. Now, I mean, it doesn't sound like much when you think like, of course, like human beings, but I've never experienced that in a US prison. Yeah. So that very fact alone made the whole event a very different kind of event. I've also never been allowed to watch a film in its entirety inside of a prison and have a discussion that was unmediated by what they call staff, which we call guards. And so it was just these little things sometimes that happen in other spaces that make us realize what is possible, and also the falseness of the claims around the kinds of extreme restrictions that we have in the US. And of course, it's not only about the US because we spread those around the world. We spread the notion of the prison as a sign of democracy starting in the 19th century, and we continue to double down on that by innovating in prison architecture, to use it as a measure to develop whether or not a state, by continuing to look at it as an indicator whether or not a country has developed a democratic system. And so we need to be among the ones who question that work. And I think one of the ways to question that work is to distribute into our popular world critical relationships to the culture that represents incarceration, which is why I've been involved in this project called Visualizing Abolition, which for me is exciting because after decades of making this argument, it's finally being heard and people are finally accepting that we have to address this problem, not from data scientists and sociologists and criminologists primarily, because if we follow that and only then illustrate what they tell us, we're starting by not questioning the very ways in which they get that data and what they do to generate the categories and the modes of thinking. And so starting from the other direction, starting from creativity, starting from imagination, aligns much better for me with the work of abolition. And so this book also includes a lot of ephemera from the movement, posters, images, things that we use to inspire ourselves, but things that also have been created by many artists as they joined the movement.
Okay, and I see that we've been speaking for about 40 minutes, and we wanted to save time for a dialogue. But I do, before ending this portion of the gathering, I want to talk a little bit about my trajectory. Gina has spoken about the work that she does on film and visual culture. And I came to this work as a consequence of as a consequence of being active in the 60s, in the Black Panther Party and the Communist Party, seeing the struggle against capitalism and the campaign against racism, but globally in support of the African Liberation Movement, for example, as one that generated the problem of political prisoners. So I started this work as someone who was supportive of political prisoners. Then I ended up becoming a political prisoner and did a book in jail in 1970, I think, called If They Come in the Morning, with some preliminary analyses of the issues that eventually came to be at the center of abolition. But I also think it's important to go back there because many people who engage in what they call prison reform see that as a discrete problem, as a single issue. All you have to do is figure out how to create better conditions for people who are in prison. And of course, we say that the issue is how to imagine a world that no longer relies on such institutions of racism and repression. So as opposed to seeing a single problem, it's a whole cluster of issues, which goes back to the problem of capitalism. And as we began to organize the abolitionist movement in the late 1990s, we had just experienced a period, a decade and a half or so of the globalization of capital, of the dismantling of social welfare programs, of shifting of capital, not only in the US, but all over the world, from areas that were designed to satisfy human need to areas of the market that were designed to produce profit. So it was in that context that here in the US, we began to witness this soaring incarceration rate. Why? Because of the fact that the economy was being deindustrialized. People were losing jobs who had lucrative jobs in industry, in the steel industry, for example, in the auto industry. All of these industries began to decline in the U.S. as they were being exported to areas of the world where labor was a lot cheaper. And so in initially developing an abolitionist strategy, we had to take these larger questions into consideration. And therefore, the solutions would not simply involve issues of punishment, but rather they would involve ways of radically transforming. I'm sorry, I brought a cold back from Portugal, and that we would have to keep all of this in mind. that we couldn't be like the prison reformer who only, wants to make sure that there's better food, that the roaches and the mice are gone. I mean, and believe me, I experienced that in the jails that I spent time in, and that does make a difference, but it's not going to prevent the reproduction of these forms of punishment. And in the process of attempting to create more and more reforms, historically what has happened is that the more reforms are instituted, the worse conditions actually become. I mean, maybe the roaches are gotten rid of, the mice are gotten rid of, but you end up having a very different classification system. Instead of just having minimum security and maximum security, you end up with a super maximum security. And those prisons may be clean, they may be aseptically clean, but they're also based on solitary confinement virtually 24 hours a day. So knowing that, we recognize as abolitionists that we can't just keep eternally trying to create better prisons, that we have to find something else. And that something else is not something that will occupy the footprint of the prison. That something else has to involve radically transforming the entire society. So abolition is another way of getting to the process of revolution, I guess I would say. Yes. And then I'll end. I'll end with revolution, right? So thank you very much for listening to us speak for 48 minutes. And so we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Could anyone possibly have a question? I do. Do you guys?
Can you stand up or do you mind?
No, I don't want to.
Here, I can take it. I'll hold the books for you.
Do you guys touch on the ideas? On the fact how our young people are sent to group homes and foster care,
Right.
and are sexually molested and really, really mistreated. And then they end up in the adult prison system and the privatizing of the prison system. That's really, really a bad trip.
Well, can I take a stab at it first?
Yeah.
The privatization of prisons is part and parcel of the increasing privatization of everything. So that's actually not that shocking, given that hospitals in this country are privatized, given people actually need in order to live has been privatized. That's a part of that juggernaut of global capitalism that began in the 1980s and led to the increasing numbers of prisons, especially here in the state of California, but all over the country. 90s. Now, expansive view of abolition. It's not just about looking at prisons and saying that we need to address the issues relating to prisons. It's not just about looking at the police. It's also about looking at schools and how schools have become increasingly affected by the thoroughgoing carcerality that has invaded virtually everything in our country. The child welfare system. During the time we were writing our book, Dorothy Roberts was writing a book entitled Torn Apart, which looks at what she calls the family policing system. And she argues that we have to stop using the term child protective services because children are not protected. It's the application of carceral strategies to children. So what we this is a pretty thin book, and there's so much that could have been included, and we wanted a manageable book. We wanted to write a short book, so we gesture in lots of different directions. We gesture, as Gina pointed out, to movements that are going on in other countries. We gesture toward the importance of looking at the family policing system, at the border struggles and the horrendous racist violence of the border police, not only in this country but in Europe, especially now, given the fact that the refugee and the refugee movement and immigrant movement in Europe and also in Africa and places like South Africa is the most important movement there. So we tried not to include everything, but to make the point that this is so much larger than what we're able even to think about right now. And that is why it's so important to stop it until, before it takes over everything.
Anybody else have a question?
Oh, I was just going to say one little thing.
Just
to
the
that.
guy way
Oh.
in the back.
Maybe I'll
Well, you
wait.
can say
I'll
it.
wait.
Sorry, I've got to be loud. I think you had said something I may have misheard about like prison, where you said that prisoners were on the board of the prison.
Mhm.
If that was correct,
Not the prison, the organization that's working with people who are incarcerated.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I misheard you.
Yeah, no.
So you mentioned you had to work to define terms for yourself. I was specifically curious about, like, you mentioned the terms harm and violence. So what was like kind of the definition you guys came to on these terms, or at least like defining characteristics?
Well, I would say what I was referring to there was not so much. So we're not the kind of people, and this is something we were working at, right? So Beth is a criminologist and sociologist. She's actually often in environments where people tell her that she needs to have a definition of whatever it is. Erica's in education, so she's much more focused on like how people learn and who's left out of learning and those kinds of questions. The two of us have I have literary and legal training, and so we have very different ways of thinking about these terms. It wasn't so much that we were writing a definition to say harm equals this. It's that we were using the term harm to describe things, for example, that sometimes are referred to as crime. So in the abolitionist movement, harm is often a replacement for the term crime, but it also is more capacious than the term crime because it identifies things that are not captured by the prison industrial complex or by the prison. In other words, what about all the people who are doing things that are technically illegal who never are going to go to prison? Or what about the ways in which we are treating each other in unacceptable ways that are not criminalized? Or what about the harm of the state itself, which is never considered a criminal, but nonetheless is right? So it's not so much that we said harm equals this. It's that every time we were writing paragraphs and we had to choose words, we had to really think carefully about how within the sentences and paragraphs, we were going to be emphasizing that way of meaning when we're thinking about concepts. Same with the concepts of violence, right? So who are the ones who are criminalized and then labeled violent? So what about the category violent prisoner? It's one of the categories that's used and thrown around so many times. And you already heard, I'm a literature person. I will not be throwing statistics at you. But a lot of times at prison organizing, we're forced to use those numbers. I think those numbers actually don't help us very much, except I can say that the vast majority of people who are incarcerated inside the US are not even labeled violent by the system itself. But when we look at their definition of violence, it's also deeply problematic. Let me give you one classic, example that many people have probably heard by now. I was talking to someone that we've worked with who was an attorney, and she was saying that she was having trouble with a local DA, because there was a woman incarcerated in Central California Women's Facility who was about to get charged with a third strike. This was many years ago. And the third strike was the threat to spit on a guard. That threat was considered enough to make that person guilty of a violent crime, right? So the way in which the state manipulates a category of violence is something we have to work against, but we also have to make the violence against us appear. So what is the violence of not having people housed? What is the violence of not letting people have mental health care without being detained? What is the violence, right? So there are all these other violences that aren't labeled violence. So it was less creating a definition than disturbing the definitions that currently exist and trying to work with those concepts in new ways.
This lady right here. Well, hello. First of all, thank you both for being here. I think being in the Bay Area and talking about things like addressing harm and violence, I normally hear restorative and transformative justice work. And just curious, I do that work myself, and just curious to know if you incorporate that in your book, and also your views and thoughts being here and living in the Bay Area.
Yeah, we do. I have to admit, I can't actually remember what we finally included, because we talked about so much. And I said, that's in the book. That has to be in the book. We spent 3 weeks talking about that.
It's on the cutting room floor, as they say.
But yeah, and as a matter of fact, we did have conversations about restorative justice and transformative justice, and the ways in which, the debate between the two, but also the amazing work that has been done by restorative justice practitioners who've gotten a lot of people out of San Quentin, for example. And of course, transforming the way we think about justice is key to the kind of abolitionist strategy that can transform the world. Not only transforming the relationship between people who may be involved in harm in some way or another, but transforming the conditions of life, the circumstances surrounding our lives, and the restorative justice as a way to work through offenses, because in restorative justice categories, oftentimes there usually is the offender, right, and the victim, and we've not wanted to use those charged terms. We wanted to, challenge the ways in which the carcerality of life in this country has turned those terms like victim and offender into these. They've reified them, objectified them, and we're arguing for a much more, I suppose, fluid, way of thinking through questions of harm, and especially, and I guess both restorative justice and transformative justice attempt to do this, especially transforming the social and political circumstances. So, and this, this continues. Go
You
ahead.
finished?
Yeah. Well, no, you can.
I just want to say that we try to be also radically inclusive in the book. So a lot of these orgs, I mean, or people we were talking about in the past, they wouldn't necessarily have been called themselves feminist or abolitionist. So it's not really about people who just claim that. Just as today, if someone walks down the street and tells me, "Oh, I'm an abolitionist," I don't know what that means because I'm not sure what work they're actually doing and how they understand it. And we have very different understandings. So restorative justice and transformative justice have been these really difficult terms that people sometimes fight about, like which one is the right one. And of course, there are some elements of racism inside restorative justice sometimes in the way it kind of uses a notion of indigenous culture and African culture. And so there's been contestation over that. There's been contestation in transformative justice about, so people use those labels for very, very different projects. So we try to lift up the projects and the people that we know that are really attending to things in an abolition feminist way, but to do that generously and to say, that the book is really about all of the different efforts to address these problems. And if you're trying to address both sides of this harm, then that would create a presence for that. But that might mean, and this is something that we really have to start to do more systematically, that we don't include certain kinds of efforts that say they're restorative justice efforts or transformative justice efforts, because the name of the thing is not how. And I think that was just back to the question about terms. I mean, this is something that I think we institutional systems that children ask questions all the time about terms, but adults somehow just wield them as if they're like weapons. And so, what else can we do?
And also, there's a tendency to want to have a definition, and we try to work against those kinds of tendencies in the book. We try to also work against the notion that the success of a particular organization or formation will be measured by the extent to which it is known, by the extent to which it makes these marks on history. And what we did was to look for small groups, and that part of the book is focused largely on Chicago, although not only Chicago, but small grassroots formations that end up not existing very long. Just maybe they exist only a couple of years, but they help to transform the language that we use. They leave traces in the way the movement functions. So we wanted to value these often small groups that are, otherwise completely fall out of history. And I mean, a lot of you, if you're activists, you know what I'm talking about. A group may come into existence. It's really exciting for a little while. You do some work, and then it no longer works, and so it gets disestablished, and it gets thrown out of history. So we try to think about the fact that abolition feminists transformations, don't necessarily make huge splashes, but they change little by little. The way we refer to harms, for example, as opposed to using the term crime or all kinds of examples. So in that sense, as Gina pointed out, would be reluctant to choose that, okay, the transformative justice is better than restorative justice because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Somebody from this side? Right there.
So is there a single piece of advice you can give us into stepping more of an abolitionist mindset? I feel like since we live in this prison industrial complex society, we kind of internalize a lot of these things about dealing with it. So what is one action we can take as individuals to kind of lean into this mentality?
Okay,
Oh, she gets that one to me. I have one.
No, it's only because I've spoken less.
I'm joking. I'm gonna cheat and I'm gonna quote someone we quote in the book several
Right.
times. Mari Matsuda,
Matsuda.
who's a critical race theorist, a legal scholar, amazing
She
person.
is a critical race theorist.
Well, yeah, I just meant because she
No,
was there
no,
at the
no, I
beginning
was-
of the movement.
I know,
She's still alive.
I would no. I was just being sarcastic because critical race theory is thrown around.
Oh,
And
no, she's an
every-
actual one. Like came
So
from the
that's
legal
what I
studies.
meant.
Yeah. So, but she has a phrase which we use again and again, which is ask the other
Oh.
question. So this is important for academics, of course. Who the joke of it is for us. It's not funny to everyone. The joke of it is often that academics are considered to be deeply thoughtful and whatever. But academics operate with the same reflexes as everyone else, and so the same principle can be used there. Ask the other question. So if you think you're writing about racism and you think you know everything about racism, ask the other question. Where's gender in this? Where's ability in this? Where's class in this? And the same with organizing. Asking the other questions. So you feeling really like you're young and you know lots of things, and then so ask, what don't we know? Is it a place we need to know about? Is it a local organization we don't know about? Is there some aspect of the prison industrial complex that we're not paying attention to? It's being an abolitionist, because it's a revolutionary project, is to be conceptually ready to always be the one who doesn't know and to ask the other question. And I think it's maybe the most important thing I think we all agreed on as the four of us as co-authors was that one of the difficult things for us, and Angela is obviously in a position of always having to speak out and always having to sort of be considered the central person, which is one of the interesting things that happened to us when we were working together, is that she wasn't in that position of being alone. And so, but the rest of us, have been part, kind of quiet inside movements, not being always out there as the primary person speaking, but doing that quiet work of always looking around, looking to be involved in something that maybe isn't the thing that's always getting the most attention, is really a part of that work. So I would say that would be the advice.
My question would be, what would you say to sexual assault survivors? And I say sexual assault survivors and not victims. For those group of people that do believe in this movement, however, it may seem that if you're taking it in such a general sense that the legal system doesn't exactly give women their sense of worth if they go through with it, but also if we do move forward with this type of movement and punishment isn't what we're looking for, and instead we rehab or look for treatment and things like that, that women always end up being like less and less and less, and we're not the overarching thought that comes to mind when we're thinking of reform, because our bodies are even looked at as less than a consideration when thinking about this movement.
Okay. Well, there's several ways in which I would approach that question, and thank you for posing it. One has to do with the fact that you're right, because women in general are rendered marginal around a whole range of issues, because women constitute a relatively small percentage of people who are behind bars. So questions of abolition, incarceration, are often seen to be questions that involve primarily people gendered as men. I'm going to get to your question about sexual violence in a second, but I just want to look at the larger issue, and point out that the points that we try to make in this book is that you can't use quantitative measures as an indication of what is most important. And that, as a matter of fact, even though people gendered as men constitute the vast majority of those behind bars, if you begin to look at gender non-conforming people, if you look at people gendered as women, the frame becomes so much more complicated. You learn so much more about the system, even though women may only constitute 14% of the prison population. What you learn by looking at the conditions and the issues surrounding women is something that is far more indicative of how the system actually works. So you actually end up learning more about men than you would know if you only focused on those who constitute the majority of the population. I mean, this is a conversation we started to have when we were organizing critical resistance back in the 90s, and we argued. Well, first of all, I should tell you that a lot of us had forgotten that the overwhelming majority of the organizers of the first abolitionist conference were women. This shows you how powerful ideology is. There were,
And most women are survivors.
yes. So there's that larger question that has to do with research and explanation and intellectual engagement and so forth. Then there's the question of the impact of abolition on what was then the existing feminist movement. So at the very outset of that movement, the response was, and it's understandable, now that women have finally been recognized as deserving of some attention with respect to violence, with respect to intimate violence, with respect to sexual violence. Now you're telling us that you want to get rid of the very ways in which we have historically attended to those who have been the subjects of or rather the objects of that violence. So abolition was originally viewed as something that was designed to counteract the progress that women had made in struggles against these issues. And we had to work and continue to work really hard to come up with acceptable options for why a woman who has just injured and trauma, why you would say, well, let's give a second thought to the idea that the person who actually committed this should automatically move along a trajectory that's going to send him to prison. So the argument is complicated. It has to do with the fact that that prisons reproduce the very violence that they are assumed to address. So someone who has committed such an act, you send that person to prison, and when that person gets out, more than likely, that person is going to be even more violent than when they went in. Because violence and sexual violence too, sexual violence in male prisons is one of the ways in which the prison system is controlling of all of the prisoners who are there, of all of the people inside. They use sexual violence. They encourage rape and sexual violence in men's prisons. So there's that question. There's also the question of once you put someone in prison, then it's as if the problem is solved. Although you do it over and over and over again, and the problem has increased in the larger society, the fact that the prison serves as a kind of dumping ground for problems that we don't really like to think about, because you have to think, because it's too difficult. And you have to think long and hard, and you're not going to come up with a solution overnight. But the prison is a simplistic solution. All you do is put them behind bars, and then you don't have to think about dealing with the question of sexual violence in the larger world. Some scholars have done research on this, and they've discovered that even though over the last 40 or 50 years, there's been a proliferation of all kinds of ways of dealing with sexual violence. There's been imprisonment. There's also all of these programs that did not exist 50 years ago. And even with all of that, the incidence of sexual violence has not decreased at all. So that must tell us that we're not approaching this in the right way. And if we keep on doing the same thing over and over and over again, there'll continue to be no results. So abolition suggests that you think about the larger context. And sometimes this is painful because there's no immediate solution. And if someone is hurt, they want to see solutions that often turn out to be no solutions at all. So many people who have had people put to death as a consequence of harm, they recognize afterwards that didn't do anything at all. And so, yeah, I'm just gesturing, towards the fact that this is what we try to simplify questions that answered overnight, but we, try to gesture towards the work that will be necessary in order to move in that direction.
Sorry, I know that was a really long answer, and I know we don't have as much time, but I do want to add two things, though, just specifically on this. One is that a lot of the way we write is generated from people inside the anti-domestic violence movement talking about strategies that have been generated from inside. So it isn't as if those are being avoided. The other thing is that we have a resource section, and I think it's really important that the book was also naming organizations, naming resources. There's a creative interventions toolkit some of you may know about. There are other kind of materials out there that I want people to know that are out there. And also, we don't encourage people to be unsafe. So it's not as if we're saying that when you're in a situation and there's nothing around you that is a structure that can support you, you shouldn't, you should just be alone and having to face this on your own. But there generally are people in communities that have dealt with this before and have other ways of supporting, and those networks are being more and more developed. And so hopefully this book and the work that people are doing is also going to increase the presence of those kinds of community-based local organizations that potentially can be scaled up to create real safety for people.
Okay,
So I think
we've gone way
over.
over. What, you didn't have a good time? Can we hear this again, please? I would like to ask those that are able-bodied to please put your chair up against the wall if you can. We are not going to rush. We're not going to push. We're going to take our time. These two are doing all the work. All you got to do is stand there. We're going to have autograph line on this side, book buying